I didn't raise my voice when the HOA president slammed her fist on the table and accused me of trespassing. I didn't even bother answering her question. Instead, I reached into my leather folder, slid a crisp set of papers across the boardroom table, and let them read the state-registered boundary survey stamped with the county seal. Watching their lawyer's expression shift from smug certainty to pale, tight-lipped silence was better than anything I could have said. For weeks, they had called me a liar, a troublemaker, even a criminal. But now the weight of the survey sat in front of them like a hammer. I had warned them to stop cutting into my property. They didn't listen. And now, under the eyes of their own attorney, they finally realized they had crossed a line they couldn't erase with fines, threats, or empty letters. The truth is, I hadn't moved to this neighborhood looking for a fight. My life before all this was quiet, almost stubbornly simple. After years of grinding city work and too many sleepless nights, I wanted something steadier, something I could touch with my hands. That's why I came back to the parcel my grandfather once owned, tucked between pine trees and a winding creek that never seemed to dry up, even in the hottest summers. The cabin wasn't much at first, just an old, one-story box with a slanted roof, sagging porch boards, and a chimney that hadn't seen a fire in decades. But it was mine. Every morning started the same way. I'd step outside with a mug of black coffee, listen to the crows bickering in the treetops, and watch the mist burn off the grass as the sun climbed. Sometimes I'd walk the fence line, checking posts, tightening wire where deer had pressed through, or just reminding myself where my boundaries stood. My grandfather built that fence, and I treated it like a handshake across time, his way of telling me, "This is yours. Keep it standing." I didn't need much else. I had a small garden, a pickup that rattled but still ran, and weekends filled with small repairs that felt more like rituals than chores. I wasn't the type to poke my nose in other people's business. I wasn't interested in sitting on a board, policing paint colors, or gossiping about neighbors. I figured if I minded my own fence, paid my taxes, and waved politely, I'd be left alone. That was the life I thought I had bought into when I settled here, a slice of peace carved out from the noise of the world. But as I would come to learn, peace doesn't sit well with people who build their identities on control. And in this neighborhood, control had a name, a board, and a set of rules that seemed to multiply out of thin air. The first sign of trouble didn't even look like trouble at the time. It was just a slip of paper taped to my fence one morning like some lazy version of a summons. The bold red letters across the top said, "Notice of violation," and the rest was a mess of legalese accusing me of unauthorized alterations to perimeter fencing. I actually laughed out loud when I read it. The fence they were talking about had been standing for decades, long before half the board members even lived here. It wasn't new, it wasn't altered, and it sure as hell wasn't unauthorized. It was mine. I assumed it was a mistake. Maybe they had the wrong lot number. Maybe someone confused my boundary fence with one of those prefab, HOA-approved privacy panels that sprouted up in backyards like weeds. I folded the notice, stuck it in my back pocket, and figured it would all clear up with a phone call, but a few days later I found a second notice and then a third. This time, the language was harsher threats of fines, warnings of legal action if I didn't restore the property to compliance. They were demanding I remove the fence, the same fence my grandfather had built and I had maintained for years. It wasn't just insulting. It was surreal. I went down to the HOA office in person, thinking maybe if I spoke face-to-face with someone, we could clear it up. Instead, I was met with the president herself, a woman whose entire personality seemed distilled into pursed lips and a clipboard. She told me without hesitation that the fence was encroaching on OO common property, and that unless I tore it down at my own expense, fines would begin accruing at $100 per day. I remember standing there, trying to process the absurdity. The common property, she claimed, was theirs. It was the exact strip of land described in my deed. My surveyor's markers were still in the ground, iron rods driven deep enough to outlast any board president's career. But no matter what I said, she just repeated the same rehearsed line. The fence is out of compliance. The board has decided. That was the moment confusion started turning into something heavier. It wasn't just an error. It was an attack. And the people doing it weren't interested in facts, they were interested in power. At first, I still believed diplomacy might work. I didn't want a war with my neighbors, and I figured most of them probably didn't even know what the board was doing in their name. So I wrote an email calm, measured, polite. I attached a copy of my deed, highlighted the legal description, and even included a photo of one of the original survey pins still set in the ground where my fence line ran. I thought surely, when they saw the evidence, they'd back down. The reply came 2 weeks later, and it was a single sentence. The board has reviewed your concerns and determined that the violation remains. No explanation. No acknowledgement of the documents I had sent. Just a brick wall. I tried again, this time with certified mail. I printed copies of the deed, the county plat map, and the letters I had already received from them. I asked very clearly for a meeting to resolve the matter. A week later, I got another violation notice, this one larger, uglier, and now threatening to file a lien against my property if I did not remediate the encroachment. That word, remediate, sat in my gut like a stone. They weren't just telling me to move a fence. They were trying to rewrite the ground beneath my boots. So I went to a board meeting. I sat through an hour of arguments about lawn heights and mailbox paint until they finally gave me 2 minutes at the microphone. I laid it out as simply as I could. This fence is on my property. Here is the deed. Here is the survey pin. Here are photographs. I might as well have been talking to drywall. They smirked, they whispered, and then they voted unanimously to uphold the violation. That was the moment something shifted in me. I realized they weren't stupid. They weren't confused. They were betting on intimidation. They thought I would get tired or scared or poor and give in. That realization stripped away the last of my patience. I stopped writing emails. I stopped making phone calls. And late that night, I pulled my grandfather's old lockbox out from under the bed. Inside were papers yellowed, brittle, some nearly falling apart that smelled faintly of dust and cedar. I sat at the kitchen table, spread them out one by one, and thought to myself, if they want a fight on paper, I'll give them one. The first thing I did was clear off the kitchen table. I knew if this was going to turn into a paper war, I needed space to spread everything out, deeds, maps, notes, whatever records I could pull together. I wasn't a lawyer, but I understood something fundamental. Paper is power. Whoever controls the documents, the dates, the signatures, that's who wins. I started with what I already had. My deed? The plat map from the county recorder's office. The survey that had been done when I refinanced the cabin years ago. I laid them out side by side, tracing the same line with my finger over and over until I knew every word of the legal description by heart. Beginning at the iron pin set at the northeast corner of Lot 17. Those words were more than ink, they were borders, boundaries, proof that the fence stood exactly where it had stood since my grandfather hammered. In the first post, but paper alone wasn't enough. I needed something they couldn't shrug off with a vote. So I started going deeper. I drove to the county courthouse and requested copies of every recorded survey for the subdivision going back 50 years. The clerk rolled her eyes, but I waited, and after a while, I had a stack of blueprints and plats that looked like the fossil record of the neighborhood. Line after line, signature after signature, all pointing to the same truth. My fence sat squarely inside my property line. At night, I scanned and filed everything into neat folders. I built a timeline of every notice, every letter, every time they moved the goalposts. I wasn't just documenting anymore. I was preparing evidence. The isolation crept in slowly. Neighbors who used to wave when I drove by started looking away. I saw them whispering at the mailbox cluster, turning their heads when I walked up. It was obvious the board was feeding them a story, painting me as some problem homeowner trying to take land that wasn't mine. That stung more than I wanted to admit. I wasn't trying to take anything. I was just trying to hold what was already mine. At night, when the house was quiet, I would sit at the table with a lamp burning low and reread the statutes. Property law, boundary disputes, civil code on easements, I dove into it like a second job. The more I read, the calmer I became. Anger gave way to clarity. The law was on my side, and not just technically ironclad, bulletproof, all I had to do was line up the pins and wait for the right moment to knock them down. There were times when the weight of it pressed hard on me. My sister called and asked why I sounded so distant. My nephew, who used to run around my yard, stopped visiting because his parents didn't want to get involved, and I'd be lying if I said that didn't eat at me. But every time I thought about quitting, about just tearing the fence down and letting them win, I remembered my grandfather. I remembered him showing me the boundary pins as a kid, telling me, "These marks will outlast all of us. They matter," so I kept digging. I hired a licensed surveyor, not just any guy with a tape measure, but a state-registered professional with the authority to stamp his findings and file them with the county. He spent 2 days on my land, pacing the perimeter, digging for pins, setting up his equipment. When he was done, he handed me a survey bound with a blue cover, the kind that means it's official, admissible, and unimpeachable. The seal at the bottom was worth more than any speech I could give. That survey became my sword. I scanned it. I made 5 copies. 1 went into a fireproof safe. 1 went into my lawyer's hands. The rest I kept ready for the day the board decided to push me too far. By the time spring rolled around, I had a binder thicker than a phone book filled with evidence. The notices they sent me, the letters I had written, the recorded plats, photographs of the fence posts, the surveyor's findings, all of it organized, dated, tabbed. Anyone who looked at it would see the same story unfold. The HOA cut into land that wasn't theirs, and then tried to bully me into silence. And here's the thing, I stopped feeling like a victim. I wasn't the one on defense anymore. I had the documents, the history, the law. They had clipboards and arrogance. I knew which side of that equation would collapse first. So when I finally got the notice that they had authorized corrective action to remove my fence entirely, I didn't panic. I didn't write another letter. I didn't even call them. I just slipped the binder into my truck, drove to their next board meeting, and sat quietly in the back row. Waiting for my turn, the board meeting was held in the same beige community center where they always gathered. Rows of metal folding chairs, fluorescent lights humming overhead, and the same stale coffee sitting in styrofoam cups on the side table. It was their little kingdom, their stage. They sat at the front behind a long folding table like judges at a talent show, clipboards in hand, wearing the smug expressions of people who believe they couldn't be touched. The president started the meeting with her usual tone, self-satisfied, clipped, the kind of voice that sounds like it's always scolding a child. She rattled through budget updates, complaints about lawns, and a debate about whether a neighbor's mailbox was too whimsical. I sat there in silence, binder on my lap, listening to them bicker as if they were running a country instead of a cull-day-sack. When it came time for homeowner concerns, I stood up. No speech, no theatrics. I simply placed my binder on the table in front of them and opened to the first tab, a certified copy of my deed. I slid it forward without a word. Then the county plat map. Then the surveyor's official report, stamped and sealed by the state. The president barely glanced at the papers before repeating her line. "Your fence is on common property. The board has already decided." She didn't even look at the survey, just waved it off like it was a grocery receipt. That's when I spoke, not loud, not angry, just steady. "The survey was filed with the county last month. It confirms the fence is exactly on my property line. If you'd like to test that, I'll be happy to see you in court. But just so you know," I tapped the stamp with my finger. "Your lawyer has already seen this." The lawyer, who had been leaning back in his chair with an expression of mild boredom, leaned forward. He picked up the survey, adjusted his glasses, and for the first time all night looked uneasy. His lips pressed into a thin line. His eyes darted to the president, then back to the paper. The silence stretched long enough for everyone in the room to feel it. Neighbors shifted in their seats. Someone coughed. The president's face went pink, then red. "This doesn't change the fact that," she started, but the lawyer cut her off with a low voice meant for her ears only. "He's right." That was the crack. You could feel the energy shift in the room. The board members looked at each other, suddenly less sure. Neighbors who had been avoiding my eyes started whispering to each other, some even leaning forward to see the documents. For weeks, they had been told I was the problem. Now they were watching the truth unfold right in front of them, stamped and sealed by the state. I didn't push it. I didn't gloat. I simply closed the binder, tucked it under my arm, and said, "I'll expect written confirmation that this matter is closed." Then I walked out, behind me. The board erupted into whispers, but I didn't need to hear what they said. I had already won. The letter arrived 2 weeks later, folded neatly in a plain white envelope with the HOA letterhead. It wasn't an apology, of course, that would have required humility, but it was close enough. After review of the submitted survey and legal documents, the board has determined that no further enforcement action will be taken regarding your perimeter fencing, in their language. That was the equivalent of waving a white flag, but the real aftermath wasn't in the letter. It was in the way things shifted slowly around the neighborhood. The fines stopped. The notices vanished. And the board members who once puffed themselves up like petty monarchs suddenly avoided eye contact when I passed by. The president, once so eager to corner me with threats and legal jargon, started crossing the street when she saw me walking my fence line. The lawyer never came back to another meeting. I heard through the grapevine he told them he wasn't interested in baseless property disputes anymore. Then the whispers began. Quiet at first, but steady. A neighbor stopped me one morning and asked, half joking, "So, you really had the survey?" Another, an older man who'd lived here longer than most, came by to say he remembered my grandfather, and that he always knew the fence was where it should be. One by one, people who had avoided me before started inching back, like they'd been waiting for proof that I wasn't the villain the board painted me to be and the board itself. They cracked. 2 members resigned within a month, citing time conflicts. The president clung on for a while, but the shine was gone. Her authority had been punctured, and no amount of clipboards or smug speeches could patch it back together. Eventually she stepped down too, replaced by someone quieter, someone who seemed more interested in balancing budgets than waging wars over fences. As for me, life went back to something like normal. I rebuilt the sections of fence they'd hacked apart, driving the posts deeper than before, tightening the wire until it sang when you plucked it. Every hammer strike felt like setting things right again, not just wood into soil, but a line drawn in the ground that no one could erase. The peace returned, though it was a different kind of peace than I had before. It wasn't naive anymore. It was earned, tempered by the knowledge that people will try to take what isn't theirs if you let them. But it also carried a quiet satisfaction. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't played their game, and I hadn't given an inch of land that didn't belong to them. Now, when I walk the fence line in the mornings, I notice the way neighbors glance over and then look away. Some wave stiffly. Some pretend not to see me at all. I don't mind either way. Respect doesn't always look like friendship, and silence is sometimes better than forced politeness. The important part is that the fence still stands straight, solid, exactly where it's meant to be, and every time I pass one of those iron survey pins, the ones my grandfather showed me all those years ago, I nod at it like an old friend. Because in the end, it wasn't me who beat the HOA, it was the truth set in the ground long before they ever showed up. The survey just reminded them of it. Now they wave when I drive through, or they turn away. Either way, it's quiet again.